How's it going, guys? No intro or fan art or anything like that today. I think today is probably just going to be a bit more of a toned down, me talking to you guys type of episode. Because, as many of you guys know, I used to be a young Earth creationist. But there are some other things that kind of intersect with that. I used to also be a bit of an anti-SJW. Now, I never made a anti-SJW channel going into all the reasons why feminism is cancer or any of that stuff, so you're not going to find any stuff in my past like that. But I do know that there's at least a few people in my audience who do consider themselves anti-SJWs or gamergaters or any whatever word you want to use for them. Free speech absolutists who believe that the only people who ever actually get offended by something are snowflakes. If you are one of those people, then this video's for you. And if you're somebody who went on a similar journey and just want some kind of solidarity, then this video is probably also for you. So, as it turns out, anti-SJW stuff and young Earth creationism kind of go hand in hand. Turns out a lot of bigotries end up intersecting, regardless of the fact that a lot of anti-SJW rhetoric mainly came out of atheist skeptic YouTube channels. I engaged with the rhetoric well before I actually discovered those YouTube channels. I mean, I didn't even know there were atheist YouTube channels at the time, or skeptic channels, or anything like that. That was completely outside of my purview. I did watch a lot of Alex Jones back in the day, but that was a very long time ago. We're talking at least a decade. I do not have any idea of how much of his ideas I actually internalized at the time. My memory during that time is very fuzzy. I know that I was watching him a lot preparing for an apocalypse or a war that never really came, and I think I just kind of burnt out. I was also a pretty big proponent of offense always being taken and never given, and would call people snowflakes when they got offended whenever I used slurs or engaged in ableism before I even knew what the term ableism even meant. I'd never actually considered the question of gender. Of course, there were only two, right? Gender's biology. At least that's what I thought. That bubble kind of got popped when I started dating a feminist, and I did that for a few years. And that journey had quite a few ups and downs. We were both fairly toxic people, but there are some lessons that I took out of that. I got introduced to a lot of ideas that were outside of my box. Some of that started when I tried introducing her to one of the animes that I really enjoyed at the time, High School of the Dead. If you've seen High School of the Dead, then you probably know about how well this went. Yeah, it's a lot of that. It's a whole lot of that. So she refused to watch past the first episode because the show obviously objectified women a lot. For no real good reason outside of just being gratuitous. Of course, we then have other conversations. Things about, like, skimpy outfits in video games and in anime. And, of course, I would defend these things constantly. And I didn't know why I was defending them. I would later find out it was because I was internalizing a lot of things. She would tell me things like, gender's a social construct, and of course I would fight back that gender's rooted in biology, it can't be a social construct, it's very, very real, it's an incredibly real thing. It turns out I had no idea what a social construct was. If you talked to me about money being a social construct, I would have argued against that too, because I was dumb. We would talk about gay rights, and I would point out that, well, they had the right to marry. What other rights do they need? They've got rights. We have equal rights. We've achieved equality. Congratulations, America. We'd have conversations about racism, and I would say, well, we don't really have an issue with racism. We have some individual racists, but by and large, the Civil Rights Act happened several years ago. We can't possibly have a racist problem now. Please note that I made all of these arguments without looking into any data or doing any actual research. And the few times that I would Google something, I would heavily engage in confirmation bias. Instead of looking into any actual studies, I would go for the first article that looked like it agreed with me and then shove it in her face and go, aha, look, I Googled it, I'm correct. Gender pay wage gap? I didn't believe that existed at all. As far as I was concerned, employers couldn't just pay you a separate amount of money than someone else just because you were a different gender. little did I know, an employer can pay you whatever they want for whatever the hell reason. They don't actually have to agree by any standards, aside from ones explicitly talked about in your agreements with them, and also, minimum wage. I would find arguments like women don't end up going into higher risk fields, and that's why there's a pay wage issue. Little did I realize that just kicked the can down the road and argued that, yeah, if the pay-wage gap exists and it's because women are not taking positions that are more risky, we've cultivated an environment where they don't, as opposed to cultivating an environment where they will engage in risk-taking as well. So it's just kicking the can down the road, but I didn't feel like it was that. I felt like it was a gotcha. I felt like it was a win for me because I had to be correct and right, and it's no wonder that relationship failed. Trans people? I mean, they existed, but, they were less than what I considered normal people. I couldn't explain to you why. I didn't have a justification. That's just kind of where I was. No different than back when I used to be racist, but that phase didn't last very long. And as far as pronouns were concerned, I mean, why would I have to ask anybody their pronouns? I could figure that out just by looking at them, right? I would never conceivably enter a scenario where I wouldn't be able to figure out what somebody's pronoun was just based on looking at them, right? That would never happen to me. In every one of these scenarios, I came up with a simple excuse for every single time that something came in conflict with my worldview. I had to have been correct as an a priori, and then I would engage in confirmation bias to make sure that no matter what, I would always come out the other side as correct, which basically is just the type of behavior I was taught to engage in when I was a young Earth creationist, just talking about social issues instead. I started learning to dismiss certain ideas that she threw at me by just calling her a Tumblrina. Usually internally, this is not a thing I would tell her directly, though once or twice I would, and of course that always ended in a fight. After we broke up, I discovered YouTubers like Holy Kool-Aid, Godless Cranium, Armored Skeptic, Gently Modified Skeptic. I've talked about this in my deconversion video, but they didn't really do anything at the time for my ideas on social issues outside of move me further into atheism and being more comfortable with my atheism and then heavily influencing the content that I would make later. As a side note, I actually consider some of those people friends now. But then I stumbled onto two other channels, one of which was Thunderfoot and the other was No Bullshit. Initially, the videos I watched from Thunderfoot just confirmed what I'd already learned from watching Godless Cranium, Holy Kool-Aid, etc. Just the stuff about atheism, how creationism didn't pan out scientifically. Then I got into his Anita Sarkeesian content, and I found it very engaging because I recognized a lot of the arguments Anita Sarkeesian was making from when my ex made them. And the thought appeared in my head that if I had only showed her these, she would have changed her opinion and I would have been the right one, and so on and so forth. Little did I know that that was just me being an asshole. Of course, I would watch Thunderfoot debunk these arguments from Anita Sarkeesian with facts and logic, and it just tickled my confirmation bias super hard because that's what I wanted to hear. That's what I wanted to watch. That was what I already agreed with, and he was basically feeding me a giant heaping dose of that. It justified every single time that I argued against my ex and said that I'm not a feminist, I'm an equalist, because I stand for equal rights, not realizing that I had just basically stepped on a landmine of stupid. And then, of course, there was No Bullshit. Now, I was never really able to consider myself a fan of his content, but the way that I consumed it, and the way that I consumed most of the content I was watching at the time, was through autoplay. I was working in the deli at Publix, and I, to keep myself sane, kept an earpiece in my ear at all times, streaming YouTube videos. So I listened basically in audio-only format. So when that happens, the YouTube algorithm tends to lead you down pipelines. I wasn't really aware how all this works. I was just happy that I got information sent to my ear while I was working. That was super helpful and kept me sane. But I didn't realize that I was being led down essentially the alt-right pipeline. Now, I never hit rock bottom. I never went into like the JQ or any of that other rabbit hole nonsense. Never got that far. I would never even say that I escaped the alt-right or did any of that. I just got engaged with what I now recognize were the first steps leading into that. So if y'all were wanting a full and complete retelling of how I fell down the bottom of the alt-right pipeline and clawed my way back up with rhetoric and Marxism, that's not what happened. I didn't get quite that far. I also had like a brief introduction to Steven Crowder at the time, just because that's what got filtered to me on YouTube, but I never ended up watching more than a couple episodes of the Change My Mind series. Not because I realized he was peddling bullshit through the superiority complex of talking to unbeknownst college kids, but because I just found it boring. So I just didn't watch. Like with my religious upbringing, I think that exposure was a big factor, like a big problem. When I stopped watching the content, it was not like my opinion changed, but my opinion was no longer being reinforced, and I was now open to other ideas. In the beginning, my opinion was completely anti the person I was dating, because I just had to be right, and I was engaging in a lot of confirmation bias, and everything that was intuitively correct must have also been just correct. And then that confirmation bias got fed when I started watching these YouTubers. But when I started to distance myself from that factor, that reinforcement factor, just kind of went away. I didn't consider myself an anti-SJW, but I was dating someone who basically was an SJW, and I was anti everything they were saying. So I guess it was a distinction without a difference. As I started watching more YouTube videos and engaging more in online spaces, especially on Twitter, I started noting that there was a little bit of a cultural shift. The gender as a spectrum crowd was no longer just confined to Tumblr, and the sexism in games conversation was no longer limited to what I considered SJW spaces. These were just happening, and moreover, they were happening among YouTubers that I watched. And I didn't really know anything about fallacies yet. I didn't know about argumentum ad populum, that the popularity of an idea doesn't necessarily mean that it's any better or worse. But at least in this instance, I started to see more people engage in the rhetoric, talking about gender, talking about sexism, and I decided that maybe that meant that the ideas had some merit. Again, bad reasoning, but I hadn't actually studied any philosophy yet. Before, I would always ask my partner for her research, the reasons that she believed the things that she did, instead of trying to figure out why I believed my own beliefs intuitively. And what I found was that she had been parroting things that she had seen on Tumblr or in what I considered SJW spaces. But that didn't necessarily mean she was wrong and that I was right. It just meant that she wasn't able to articulate to me why she was right. So then I started actually reading articles and not just engaging in confirmation bias about things like gender, and came across a line that stuck with me for a while. The fact that gender was a social construct and sex was the biological distinction. And I think that was the piece that, had it been explained to me before, would have stopped me in my tracks a lot sooner. I was operating under the idea that gender and sex were just synonyms for the same thing. I hadn't been operating under the idea that these were distinctions. So basically, having this shit properly explained to me helped a lot, and it knocked out at least that one barrier, that one intuitive notion that I'd been holding on to. There were still a few others to go, though. Like, yeah, I had figured that gender was how we dress, perform, how we look and present ourselves, how we act and label ourselves, and that there was a chromosomal difference where sex was concerned, but that had nothing to do with everything I just mentioned. That was all gender. But that was just one loss. I counted that as one loss. This is one thing that I believed that I was wrong about, and then I moved on. As a kid, I grew up playing games like Dead or Alive and enjoying Soul Calibur 2, especially the parts where when characters fell on the ground, their skirts flew up and you could see their underwear, and didn't actually take any time to engage in some introspection. I didn't look at any of that and see any of that as a problem. That was just a thing that happened in the game. Woo. And I could come up with a myriad of apologetics as to why I was fine. Like, oh, well, it's realistic that the skirt would fly up, or, oh, it's realistic that the boobs would bounce so much. Those were my reasonings, as opposed to arguing with myself over why a artist or why a company would specifically have that stuff in their game, not realizing that I was being directly marketed to as a horny teen. But then I worked about 3 years at QT, and during my time there, I worked on the signage team. for those who've ever worked at QT before, I was part of the team that every couple months or so would come together and would change out all the signage in all the stores, and then go back to your regular job afterwards. But because I did that, I got to look at advertisements a lot. There's only so much time you can spend inside the car with your manager waiting to get to the next store where you don't at least think a little bit about the signage you're putting up and about why particular colors are being used, why particular angles are being used for food, and something eventually clicked. I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but something clicked that, oh, wait a minute, women's bodies can be advertised in the exact same way, and I just was ignoring that fact. Like, as a kid, I wasn't playing Dead or Alive primarily because it was a good fighting game. I was also playing it because I was wanting to see Kasumi and Ayane jump around with their tits bouncing up and down. I mean, I definitely still enjoy that, but at least now I actually am self-aware about that instead of completely in denial about the fact that I'm literally being marketed to with boobs. Like, High School of the Dead was still a good anime with a solid story, but the only character from that anime that I legitimately remember is Psycho, and I think there's a reason why. Yeah, if you can't catch the sexual undertones in scenes like that, I don't know what to do with you. But the real issue that I had to wrestle with is, what did that make me? If these fictional characters were being marketed like objects, and I consumed them like objects, what did I actually view women as? What did any of this make me? And that was a really uncomfortable feeling. It was a very uncomfortable thing to actually try to figure out. I had to wrestle with the idea that liking media like this might make me a bad person. I would later conclude that that's not the case. I was engaging in something called thinking in binaries. It took me a while to come to realize that liking media like that doesn't necessarily reflect on you terribly as a person. You just have to be cognizant of what you're actually consuming. Another important trick is to not apply unrealistic anime standards to actual people. Coming to terms with this made feminist critique of video games seem a little less cringy to me. I knew how marketing and advertising worked, I knew how sex appeal worked, and after wrestling with the idea that I might be a horrible person, I came out of the other side realizing I wasn't, and that these critiques were valid. I think therein lies the trick, though. When someone critiques a piece of media that you like, it can feel like an internal critique of you. Like, you start making up any justification why you are allowed to like the media that you enjoy, and potentially why other people should like it as well, if they don't enjoy it the same way you do. And you get kind of wrapped up in that. You start tying your identity into these things. That's a really unhealthy way to look at anything. Like, if someone were to critique Pokemon, and I were to immediately defend it to the death and say that it has no faults, then yeah, that would be an unhealthy relationship with media. It's especially bad when we're dealing with media that engages in sexism. As it turns out, though, you can like sexy fictional characters and still understand that there is an over-sexualization problem in media. The thing that came last, though, was the words thing. The idea that words cannot be in and of themselves offensive, and any offense anyone takes is internalized, and the idea that anybody who engages in that kind of offense is automatically a snowflake. Like with media, it turns out the thing that actually caused me to reverse my decision on this, that caused me to change my mind, was the same. It was the idea that there was an internal wall inside me, and I was refusing to engage with it because I didn't want to know what the ramifications of that would be. So, for instance, if I started to accept that my words held value, they held some type of good or harm potential in them innately when I spoke them into the world, I had to engage in a level of responsibility for what I said. And if I started engaging in responsibility for the words that I said, then that meant I had to engage in responsibility for everything I'd ever said. And that's a very, very hard road to walk down. Turns out, though, the thing that helps out most here is learning not to think in binaries. There's area in between liking this media is misogynistic and bad, and liking this media is good and it's not misogynistic. There's an area in between where you can recognize that you like the sexualization in the media, but you also recognize then it's problematic and in some cases can be overdone. There's areas in between that you can sit, and that's a thing that I hadn't been engaging in. It's much the same thing that happened with words and how people take offense. It's not offense is always given, and therefore I have to take responsibility for everything I've said in the worst possible way, or offense is always taken, and therefore I can be as candid as I want. I'm just being blunt and truthful. There's areas in between where you can go, I should be careful of how I am portraying myself so as to be received better, because I control the narrative first, and then it's received. And then there's an area in the middle ground as well, where you accept that sometimes people are going to strawman what you say. You are responsible for how you deliver what you say, but people are also responsible for taking your words in context. Realizing that there is a comfortable middle ground between those two that you can engage in helped me a lot with getting out of my right to offend everybody around and therefore I must be offensive to the people around me really cringy phase. Like with media, I didn't want to take that time to introspect. I didn't want to take that time to look at myself and think about all the things I had said to people in the past. I had to break out of the binary of thinking that things were either good or bad. A lot of anti-SJWs think in binaries. There's no sliding scale for activism. It's either good and effective, or it's just cringe, full stop. Awkwardly, that dividing line usually is somewhere before they were born for good activism, and activism that happens in their life now is cringe. That's not all the time. That's just what I've witnessed and also what I engaged in. The last thing I probably need to talk about is thought-terminating cliches. I didn't know what these were back then, but now that I've done research into cults, I understand what a thought-terminating cliche is, and I want to talk about that with you guys, because it's actually pretty important for the subject of the video. So, if you have an a priori that feminism is cancer, then when Anita Sarkeesian critiques a video game you like, she's a feminist. Why listen to her? I have my own critiques on Anita Sarkeesian, but there's a thought-terminating cliche for she's a feminist. Dismiss what she said. Someone got offended because you used a slur around them? They're a snowflake. It's their fault for being offended. That's a thought-terminating cliche. Someone says there's more than two genders? They're an SJW denying biology. Why listen? Just laugh. Again, a thought-terminating cliche. And then probably one that we've heard 1,000 times, at least during the Red Scare, that person shouldn't be listened to. They're a communist. That is a thought-terminating cliche. These were things that I engaged in a lot. There were a group of people I'd significantly otherized, and if any critique fell into the category of things that I'd already otherized, I could just effectively not listen to it. It was shorthand for actually engaging in conversations. Instead of engaging in an actual dialogue with someone who happens to be a feminist, you just say, "You're a feminist. Why should I listen to you?" Here's one you've probably dealt with at least once. If you're an atheist and you critique the Bible, a Christian can just tell you that you're an atheist. Why should he have to listen to you? Again, it's a thought-terminating cliche. It's used so that they can dismiss you out of hand instead of actually engaging with any critique you might have, and it prevents them from determining whether or not critique is actually valid. This is also a genetic fallacy, dismissing something that someone said based on the source alone. So, if you can have a takeaway from that particular thing, then I have a game for you to play. The next time you decide to subject yourself to Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, no bullshit, etc., please count how many times per video that you watch that they engage in the thought-terminating cliche. That when they say something is either SJW, or cringe, or leftist, and they use that as a method of dismissal. Just have fun. Hell, turn it into a drinking game if you're brave. I never went down the alt-right pipeline all the way, or even half of the way. I just kind of dipped my toes and managed to avoid a lot of the Gamergate malarkey and all that other shit. But the time that I spent there, and the person that I used to be, gave me a lot of insight. And those are the things that I came out with. The thought-terminating cliches, the ideas that things are always in binaries, are either good or bad, and the idea that your internal issues, the internal critique you might have to take of yourself when you start considering certain positions, can be a barrier to entry. These are what I took away from my personal journey, and maybe there's some of the things you take away from any journey you've had, if you maybe fell down the pipeline a little bit and then popped out. I actually want to know what that journey looked like, and the best way for you to let me know would be in the comments section below. I know this isn't some exciting story about how I fell down the pipeline and crawled my way up, and now I'm here and better than ever. I don't have one of those stories, and I'm not going to embellish my story to make it sound like one of those, to make it more appealing to an audience. I'm going to give you my story as I remember it, without embellishment as best as I can. If you happen to have a friend who seems to be falling down one of those pipelines, then maybe engage with them through the frame of mind that they're not a bad person, and they're not even trying to be a bad person, but they might have some internal issues that they haven't really resolved yet and they don't want to resolve. And by falling down that pipeline, they can effectively live in a fantasy where they never have to resolve those issues. They can engage in thought-terminating cliches to ignore critiques that make them look any worse than the regular Joe they think they are. They can engage in thinking of binaries that makes them always the good person and the people that disagree with them are always bad. Maybe, just maybe, they haven't actually taken the time to consider what any of this actually means for them. And if you're their friend and you're in a position to actually have a conversation with them about what they're doing, then maybe you'll be able to get somebody out of that. If they say that something is feminism and then it's bad, or something is socialism and then it's bad, ask them what they even mean by that, and ask them why that's bad. Why are those things bad? Sometimes they haven't even taken the time to consider that themselves. And that first step, that first bit of introspection, as long as it's handled correctly, can maybe start a snowball effect of getting them out, preventing them from falling down the road and embracing the JQ and listening to Richard Spencer. But hopefully some of those takeaways help you. That's what I found on my personal journey. That's what helped with me. And hopefully some of this helps you. If it does, awesome. Let me know in the comment section below. If not, then, I mean, hey, let me know down there as well. I'm sure one of you wants to call me an SJW cuck. Something like that. I'm sure that that's a thing you'd like to do. But that said, if you've made it to this part of the video, then you're, of course, at the patrons. Anybody who has been a $20 or higher patron for at least a month gets one of these slides. And if you are a $20 and higher patron for at least a month and you have not got one of these, then send me a message. Like, send me a message on Patreon so I can rectify that. I can get in contact with my artist and commission those. That's a super awesome thing. I did not expect this video to be as long as it was. I typed out like a very rough outline on Notepad to keep me on track, and I still ended up going off into the weeds. I don't generally write scripts for any of my videos, and I generally don't even use bullet points. So apparently things get worse when I try to be organized. I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry that we didn't get a Hammered Out episode this Tuesday. There should be one next Tuesday. Just schedules didn't line up for this one. That said, remember that Thursdays are video game streams where we are going to be playing games together. If you would like, I'm going to be doing League, and if that's something you want to do, then Thursday we will be able to do that. But I think we're basically at the end of this thing. We're at the end of the video. This has gone on way too long. Boy. Anyways, as always, everyone. Insert end of video tagline here.